I think it's not an easy journey, but to really drive change within a city, it means you need to work with all stakeholders and you need to leverage both your hard and soft powers to bring about change. I think, first of all, we need to take a step back and think about what's happening in the city's world, and particularly in relation to climate change. So what we're seeing right now is that most cities are joining the race to zero as we move towards COP26 and, pledging that they will cut their carbon emissions by at least 50% by 2030 and be net zero carbon by 2050. And some, of course, many of the ambitious cities are seeking to do that beforehand. But whilst we want to make cities net zero carbon, there's a lot of actors in the system. I think there's really four big things you've got to tackle if you want to get to net zero. One, you've got to decarbonize your energy grid. So you've got to electrify your energy grid. You've got to change the sources of energy that's going into your grid, so renewable sources. The second thing you've got to do is decarbonize your mobility, so electrify mobility. The third thing you need to do is decarbonize buildings. And fourthly, and this is where I guess cities tend to have most of their powers, you need to have a compact city. You cannot be a net zero carbon city if you do not have compact urban development. So just turning back to sort of each of those, what I will say is that cities absolutely cannot do it alone. To get to net zero, it means that they need to work with the multi-levels of government. It means they need to work with business. And I'll describe some of who they are in just a minute. They need to work with civil society and they need to work with academia. So maybe if I look at energy, for example, if you think about decarbonizing the electricity grid, I think what most cities would say is, we can't do anything here. This sits with somebody else. So, for example, it sits with whoever is in control of the electricity grid infrastructure. It may be a private utility, it may be national government, but it's very rarely in the city's purview. It's very rare that they have control over energy. So can you do anything? Some cities say, no, we can't, but actually you can. So you need to leverage the hard and soft powers that you possess to be able to act. And that means, in terms of soft powers, it's using your convening authority. It's also, making sure that your policy is drafted in such a way in your city development plan so that you can actually drive transition. The same relates to mobility. Mobility is something that, of course, you can change at the walking and cycling level, but often, again, cities don't own and control public transport systems, which makes it a little bit more difficult for them. But again, you can work with the value chain associated with mobility to try and drive that transition. Finally, buildings. Buildings is difficult. Building is difficult because you've got fragmented ownership types. But what I would say, they account, of course, for 40% of emissions. What I would say you can do is create the policy conditions to absolutely get the commercial real estate world to transition their building stock. In fact, just today, we were hosting a meeting with global CEOs of real estate where we were putting forward 10 principles for them to transition their global portfolios. And it wasn't just real estate CEOs, but it was CEOs from across industries where they occupy their own buildings. I think they are very much know and are minded by the investment landscape. ESG is driving investment. And in relation to the E, they are making investment decisions in relation to climate change. So policy can drive that change in a commercial real estate because investors have already demanded the change. Where it gets more difficult is buildings that are in ownership of maybe one person, for example, a small landlord who owns one or two properties, an individual who owns a property and has a huge mortgage. But before I turn to that, I'm going to highlight public buildings. If you think about most cities across the world, the largest real estate owner in that city is government, and that is all arms of government. So there's a critical need for the city government to work with other government agencies to understand the building stock within a city and think about how they can drive that transition. If you think about cities like Dortmund, for example, they are thinking about, okay, we own all of these buildings within our city. We can not just retrofit these buildings, but we can think about how we can generate revenue from these buildings. So, they're converting their roof space into green spaces, and they're also creating energy generation sources on these roofs, solar panels, etc., and selling that energy back into the grid. So they're thinking about ways and means that they can generate revenue from their very own buildings. But of course, that has meant they've had to borrow against the asset in the first place. You need to create bankable, investable projects. So what do I mean by bankable projects? Basically, you constantly hear from the investment world, we have lots of money, we have a lack of bankable projects. And what they mean by that is they don't have projects with the risk profile or indeed the structure that will attract investment. So in that context, you need to create a pipeline of projects in retrofit. And that means that you essentially bring an entire street together to have an investable proposition, or bring an apartment building together. So there's a huge amount of work from a convening perspective in the city. Just to turn to capital, some of the capital I was talking about there is, of course, international capital, but most projects at building level are funded by domestic capital within your city. So it's critical to work with the financing sector to drive that change. So I guess in terms of what I'm saying, you need to, as a city, be working with the multi-levels of government to bring change. You need to be working with business in terms of energy utility companies, energy technology companies, energy providers. You need to be working with the construction industry, the real estate industry, the mobility industry. And you need to be working with financiers, investors, and of course, civil society and academia if you're actually going to drive change. I think some of the cities that we've seen that have been quite successful in really taking action in relation to climate change have done things like set up a climate and resilience commission. And really what that has resulted in their cities is they're promoting and providing the city leadership on climate resilience, and they're encouraging multi-stakeholders to take action. They're providing that forum to convene the multi-stakeholders that they need to work with across the urban value chain to meet their climate goals. They're also advising city government on the most effective steps to take and the prioritization of those steps and how they need to change policy and regulation to bring about that change. And of course, they have a role in terms of the monitoring of progress and thinking about how you iterate. And I guess they also have a role in terms of advising on the assessment of climate-related risks and adaptation opportunities, but also making the economic and social case for the transition. So thinking through the co-benefits that can result if you do it right, and promoting best practices in terms of participatory governance, bringing in academics, civil society, for example, and wider citizen groups. I think it's not an easy journey, but to really drive change within a city, it means you need to work with all stakeholders and you need to leverage both your hard and soft powers to bring about change. The race to zero is at least a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. But if you're looking at what they're doing at a European level in terms of policy, they are going to look for 100 cities across Europe to be carbon neutral by 2030. And all cities across Europe to be carbon neutral by 2050. So they're asking for an even bigger lift, and they're also asking all member states to be part of that journey. So at least one city from each member state must be part of that journey to be carbon neutral. So it's a very ambitious agenda, but I think the very minimum is a 50% reduction by 2030.